All right, so the second slide is that you need to make sure that you create, as an author, as a storyteller, visual systems of meaning. And the little words in the slide kind of suggest what that means. It means that there are particular kinds of images that are in your story, that there's a color scaling that you can add to those images. You all know how to use filters that you use, and contrast because of those colors. For instance, once a change happens, you can move from one color to another color, or from one kind of filter to another filter. Transitions are very important. I think one of the most remarkable formal elements of that film, Ironing, is the way that Ryan Trauman allows silence to play a real role in establishing the systems of meaning. He fades into pictures, he fades out of pictures, and each time we're just left with a black screen. So the power of the black screen is remarkable. The transitions that Alyssa uses, so this isn't a visual system of meaning, but it's an audio system of meaning, is that when she moves from thing to thing, she uses two different strategies. One is music that moves us from one thing to another thing, and the other is her voice as a narrator speaking to us much more directly. So we're outside of the car, we're outside of that conversation with her father, and she is connecting with us, and that's her transitional device. Editing techniques, like the fades that I mentioned. Pacing, again, Ironing is really all about pacing, but each one of these three stories has a unique sense of pace. Using more speed and slowness at various points in the essay make a lot of sense. And finally, the sense of rhythm, that things are moving in a way that just makes sense according to the story. Rhythm is a very unique thing in any multimodal storytelling. The third slide in your PowerPoint has to do with the fact that in a successful story, there are always two stories. One is an internal story of change, and one is an external story. Both of them have some change involved with them, but our protagonist changes in some way, and that's a really important thing to think about. The external story also has some kind of change, and so in these stories, let's see, the external story for George's story is about the Challenger that goes up in the sky and the national response to it. And the internal story is very much his father's journey as a teacher as it's related to his connection to national identity. The two are very interwoven. The external story for Alyssa's podcast, I would say, would be the relationship between her and her dad as connected by music, and the internal story is the story of his relationship to his father and his kind of breaking free on a journey of faith through the music. And Ryan Trauman's external story is a story about how a family deals with grief and loss, and the internal story is about him changing. On the outside of the story, we think it's a story about his mom and his childhood, but actually the internal story is about how he makes sense of grief and loss. Tone and mood are often established through music, pacing, and rhythm. They can also be affected through visual styles that you can use, and there are so many visual styles that you might want to use. I suggest that when you are trying to create a tone and a mood for your story, that you think about what is the ending point. What are you eventually going to try to get your audience to feel? The next slide has to do with repetition. This to me is one of the most important parts of all storytelling, but particular multimodal storytelling. This is the idea that you set something up and you pay it off later. So this can be just a formal motif. So for instance, in George's story, we open with Ronald Reagan addressing the nation. That sort of gets paid off a little bit later when finally his father gets to the story of listening to Ronald Reagan's inspirational words in that speech that he gave to the nation. And we hear George's father talking about it, but we see a still photo of Ronald Reagan giving that speech. So the setup is that we hear a little bit of the speech, but we don't hear the key part of the speech. The payoff is when we hear George's father talking about the meaning of the speech to him, but we see the visual image of Ronald Reagan. And here's the real joy of this idea of setup and payoff, is that it just gets better, becomes more resonant with your audience the more payoffs you have. So if you have a setup and a payoff, and it feels like, oh, I mean, the audience is not aware of this at all, but the audience is like, oh, that feels so good to kind of come back to this thing and have it wrapped up in a certain way. And then later, they weren't expecting it, but there's another payoff. So Ronald Reagan, actually, we get to hear him say those words later in George's story. And I think that idea of a setup, payoff, is so important for storytellers to use. And obviously, this is not something that your narrator knows how to do. You have to craft the story in such a way that creates this setup and this payoff. Juxtaposition and contrast. In other words, when you are showing a picture, it's best if the picture does not directly illustrate the words that are being said at the time. Instead, the picture should be setting us up for what's going to come next, or what's going to come a long time from now. Or it can even be kind of unrelated in a real literal way to what is being said at the time, but it can create tone and mood. This is especially the case with Ryan Traumann's story. We do not see the corpses of either of his parents, thankfully. We don't see he and his brother sitting in their underwear on the basement while his mother irons in her pink terry cloth robe. We see a bunch of other pictures that give us a sense of the time and the place, but they aren't directly one-to-one. When you do that, sort of like you say the thing and you show the thing at the same time, it bores the audience. That juxtaposition where you put two unlike things together creates a formal sense of conflict for the audience, which makes us kind of lean forward to try to resolve what's going to happen. How are these discontinuities or incongruities going to work themselves out? Another way that juxtaposition and contrast happens in multimodal storytelling especially is through editing. You put one thing next to another thing that don't really match, and that's a great way to, again, create audience interest, to help your audience kind of lean in. So those are the kind of principles for storytelling that have to do with visual storytelling, and obviously I wove in a lot of podcast principles, but there are some podcast principles that are unique. So for one, often there is a relationship that gets established between the kind of narrator or the personality who is in the podcast every episode, and the specific things that are happening in that particular episode. So the character who's being profiled. Some of you have listened to the podcast Serial that profile an unsolved murder mystery in its first season, which is excellent, and profiled the criminal justice system in Cleveland in its third system. If you haven't listened to those podcasts, it's called Serial, Serial. I strongly recommend them when you have time, and some of you have extra time right now. They're just very rewarding stories that have so much meaning to them. Alyssa does this in her story too, right? The relationship between she and her father is a proxy for our relationship with her father, and our relationship with her as kind of the narrator is an important mediation point between us and the story. Secondly, another podcasting principle that's important to think about is the idea of sound bed. So a sound bed is kind of all the sounds that are around us all the time. Did you think that your screen froze? It didn't. I was just listening to the sounds that are around me. I heard my floor creak a little bit because of the heater. I heard a lot of different birds. I heard a dog barking in the distance. And you heard things that are in your world that I can't hear or see, because there's always kind of sound going on around us, and laying intentional sound bed underneath what happens both can provide all the various things that we've already talked about in terms of visuality. So it can create an audio system of meaning. It can kind of provide tone and mood. You can use the principle of repetition, set up, pay off. You can use juxtaposition. You can use different sounds to signify the difference between the internal and the external stories that are going on in your story. So there's all kinds of ways that you can use a sound bed for the storytelling in a podcast. Transitions is another way that you can really make your story meaningful. And I've already referred to the way that Alyssa punctuates this conversation between her and her father with her own narrator's voice that probably was recorded later, but that just kind of shapes things. We also have a clear sense that while they listened to the radio together to some of the songs on the Joshua Tree album by U2, that she clearly delayed the introduction of the song Where the Streets Have No Name, and she played it kind of separate from the car ride. It was sort of this song that like just invited us in at a particular moment. And it transitioned us to another part of the story, right? The guitar that keeps going. That's not the right name for it, but you understand what I'm saying. Okay, in the third part of this lecture, this lecture got really long, we're going to talk about the shareable darkness.